Hi everyone, it's me again. Today I'm going to read you chapter 7 of my book Wildmoore, Wrath of Zane. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 7, Stories Told and Untold. After creating a camp at the village, the knights, warriors, Fourthwind, and Natalie all settled for the night by creating a bonfire. Madeline was sharpening the arrowheads with a rock when Ackerley walked up to her with a softened look. Madeline knew what Ackerley wanted to talk to her about, and it was the last thing that she wanted. So she replied, "We cannot discuss this, Ackerley." "I understand, Madeline, but your parents would have wanted us to continue our romance, not to wallow over their loss." Ackerley tried to reason, but Madeline insisted, "All the more reason I should focus on the warriors and not the romance we once had. I'm sorry, but it is the way it is." Natalie couldn't help but overhear their conversation, and all she was thinking was, could this woman be any more stubborn? Fourthwind followed his human counterpart's gaze and replied, "I do not think Madeline would like you spying on her." Natalie turned to the guardian dragon and replied, "Your conversation is heard by not just the other warriors and knights, but half of the village population, so it doesn't exactly count as spying." Amelia walked by and said, "I have to agree with that sentiment." Suddenly, a scared whimper came out of Barlow's mouth, who stirred out of his sleep. The wolf pup was still terrified from what had happened earlier, and was afraid that those bad men would come back for him. Natalie looked over and noticed the wolf pup's terrified gaze. She asked, "Barlow, you okay, buddy?" "I'm afraid to fall asleep because of those bad men. They would try to take me again," Barlow said to the girl. Natalie felt terrible for what this wolf pup had to endure, no thanks to Zane and his men. Then a thought occurred to her, and she asked the wolf pup, "What if I read a bedtime story to help you fall asleep?" Barlow's slightly floppy ears perked up, and he asked excitedly, "What kind of story?" Natalie explained, "The story is very special to me. It's something my aunt had read to me when I was younger. It's called The Never-Ending Story." "You mean the story has no ending?" Barlow asked excitedly. Natalie was amused by the wolf pup's immediate excitement over this, so she explained, "It's not exactly what I meant, Barlow. Maybe once I told you the story now, then you'll find out what it's about." Natalie reached in her book bag to pull out the book that Kyle had given her, and Barlow leapt into her lap to hear the story better. Intrigued about the story himself, Fourthwind lay down so he could listen as well. Natalie started to read the first chapter of the book, and both Barlow and Fourthwind were captivated by the story instantly. Thomas looked on at this scene, and although the story sounded fairly new to him, even he found it interesting. However, his eyes never left Natalie, because there was something about the girl's face and compassion towards Arlo that looks vaguely familiar to him, but he couldn't seem to place her anywhere. Rhea, Ackerley's wolf companion, looked on at Natalie's retelling of the story she was describing to Barlow, and seeing that Natalie was the exact opposite of what she thought earlier, had proven her wrong. After she finished reading the first chapter, Barlow had already fallen asleep in Natalie's lap, and even Fourthwind fell asleep as well. Even reading the story had Natalie tired too, so she leaned her head on Fourthwind's furry belly and dozed off, too comfortable to move, even more so with Barlow sleeping in her lap. Unbeknownst to the group, the Forest Night Patrol Owl overheard the story, and she, along with her son, who was half her size, flew off to the northeast of the land, where lied the Fortune Cave. The Fortune Cave is a very sacred habitat to the fortune-telling polar bears, where they can see past, present, and future through a large enchanted pool. However, the pool would only be used if travelers were uncertain about who they were or what their future would be. Hoping her suspicions about one person in the camp were true, the owl needed to consult an ally of hers for confirmation. The owl and her son reached the cave's entrance. She turned to her young son and said, "Modesty, you wait here. I need to speak to an old friend." The younger owl, named Modesty, nodded his head and replied, "Yes, mother." The older owl then proceeded to enter the cave as the eyes of the other fortune-telling polar bears looked on. These powerful animals didn't normally get visitors unless it was for something concerning. The older owl approached one polar bear who stood at a ledge. The polar bear wore a shimmering sapphire crystal around his neck that contained the ability to freeze time as well as reverse it. But this ability was not often used by the fortune-telling polar bears because they believed it wasn't necessary. The polar bear had a small grin on his face to see the owl come into his domain. And he replied to his old friend, "Hello, Beatrix." Beatrix bowed her head in response before replying, "Leo Frick, long time no see." "Too long, in fact." "What brings you back to the Fortune Cave once more?" Leo Frick asked. "My son and I were on night patrol, and we saw the forest warriors and knights camping out of the village. The child is there with them," Beatrix said to him. Leo Frick looked at Beatrix with interest. That was laden with doubt. "That's not possible. The child was believed to have perished along with her mother and aunt," Leo Frick replied. "Apparently, the child has returned to Wildmoore, and she was wearing the crystal pendant around her neck, the same one that her mother had worn previously. Modesty and I witnessed the girl at the camp reading the most unusual story I've ever heard, but it cheered up Rolf's pup after he had a nightmare. This has to be the child, Leo Frick. It has to be," Beatrix replied. Leo Frick took her claim into serious thought and trotted over to the pool where it had already begun to show the image of Natalie sleeping with Barlow snoozing in her lap. Every feature, including her eyes, were strikingly familiar to the polar bear. But immediately seeing her clothing and glasses made it extremely clear to him that she came from the human earth. Then he asked Beatrix, "Is the girl aware of her heritage in this world?" Beatrix shook her head and replied, "No, she doesn't seem to have any idea." Leo Frick found this kind of situation quite interesting, as he began to tape the pieces together in his mind. The mother and aunt must have escaped to the human earth and raised the child there. But neither the mother nor aunt returned to Wildmoore with the child. He had heard and seen many stories of the past, present, and future through this pool, but this was the one story that would certainly have him puzzled. As the warriors, knights, wolves, Natalie, and Forthwind all drifted off to sleep, Madeline was the only one who stayed awake, with Ackerley still fresh in her mind. Madeline was just a young girl when she first met Ackerley. It was during the village's annual Golden Rose Festival, and there was a dancing circle where young boys and girls participated in dancing merrily. Madeline was a bit smitten with the boy holding her hand, and when they reached their early adulthood, they fell in love. Madeline and Ackerley did plan a future together, but things changed when the Dark Warlocks attacked 13 years ago, and the death of her parents weighed heavily on Madeline's shoulders, to the point where she would have to end her romance with Ackerley. Her lack of sleep from thinking of her previous romance didn't go unnoticed. Ackerley walked over and said with a casual smile, "Hello." Madeline let out an annoyed sigh and said, "I am not in the mood to speak with you, Ackerley." "Madeline, it's been 13 years since we last spoke. You cannot ignore what we used to have all those years ago," Ackerley said, attempting to sit next to Madeline, who only just stood up and walked away from him. "You know why I ended it," Madeline said, crossing her arms and silently praying for no tears to spill out of her eyes. Ackerley froze when Madeline said those words, because he did understand why their relationship was no longer existent. He remembered her and Amelia's parents from the ceremony 13 years prior to the child when he was young. But after the attack and the death of Madeline's parents, she abruptly ended their love and focused more on her training as a forest warrior. "Madeline, I understood that you were still mourning your parents, but they didn't want you to grieve over the past. They would have wanted for you to love as well, and for us to be together," Ackerley tried to convince her. Not taking this anymore, Madeline angrily turned to face him and snarled, "I do not want to hear it. The love we have between us is over, and it no longer exists. Either we put part of our past behind us and focus on defeating those horrid warlocks, or you leave the camp of your own free will." Heartbroken by her words, Ackerley walked back to the knights to go back to sleep, and Madeline joined the forest warriors to do the same. Thomas overheard the intense exchange, and once Ackerley sat down, Thomas assured, "She will come around, Ackerley." The young man let out a sigh and whispered, "I hope so." Okay, that was chapter 7. A little bit shorter this time around, but I hope you guys enjoy, and stay tuned for chapter 8. Goodbye.